The firelight danced across the high-backed chairs of the Whitfield plantation's dining hall, reflecting off the polished silver and crystal goblets as the master's family settled in for their evening meal. The air smelled of roasting meats, butter, and the faint tang of tobacco smoke from the hearth. At first glance, Samuel, the corpulent enslaved man who carried trays and served the master's table, seemed harmless, a jovial, well-fed figure who laughed with easy familiarity, too large and too slow to threaten the men who ruled over him. Yet beneath his cheerful exterior simmered a mind sharp and deliberate, a patience honed over years of observing cruelty and memorizing the weaknesses of those in power. This is the story of how one fat slave in Tennessee became more feared than the master himself, using nothing but size, intelligence, and the slow burn of vengeance. Samuel stood near the doorway, hands folded over his apron, eyes tracing every movement as the family lifted glasses for the customary toast. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 7, each toll lingering in the heavy, humid air like a warning. Before we step into this hidden chapter, where are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment, and if stories like this grip you, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been quietly whispered in Tennessee for generations. Samuel had been at the Whitfield plantation for as long as he could remember, a fixture of labor and observation. From the earliest years of his life, he had been taught obedience, but he had also learned to watch and listen. Every punishment, every insult, every gleam of satisfaction in the master's eyes when he inflicted cruelty upon another enslaved person was catalogued in his mind. He was corpulent, jovial, seemingly indulgent, and for that reason, the overseers and even Colonel Whitfield himself dismissed him as harmless, a harmless fat man whose laughter and appetite masked nothing more than subservience. Colonel Whitfield, a man of imposing stature himself, ruled the plantation with a mix of intimidation and calculated cruelty. His authority was enforced through lashings, fines, and public humiliation, and yet he prided himself on his ability to read people, to measure loyalty, and to reward it. Samuel had been granted rare proximity to the master. He served meals at the head table, carried wine and trays directly into Whitfield's study, and was allowed inside the drawing room where the family discussed estate matters. To the Whitfields, this proximity was a token of trust. To Samuel, it was a lens through which he could examine every detail of their lives. Even as he laughed with the family, offered courteous bows, and wiped crumbs from the table, Samuel was learning the subtleties of power. He noted the overseer's patterns, the hours he rose and walked the fields, the moments he spent in indulgence, the servants he favored and those he punished. Each observation, each tiny infraction of the master's household, became part of a larger mental map that Samuel would use to turn privilege into leverage. The other enslaved people on the plantation had learned to tread lightly around him. Samuel's size alone commanded respect, but it was his quiet intelligence, his keen observation, and his patience that made others deferential in subtle ways. While the overseer wielded a whip to maintain authority, Samuel wielded something far more dangerous: foresight. Every act of cruelty he witnessed, every injustice he endured, was being converted into strategy, a slow, deliberate preparation for a reckoning that would come not in rage, but in precise, inevitable justice. Tonight, as the Whitfield family dined, Samuel moved fluidly between roles: obedient servant, silent observer, and concealed architect of revenge. His laughter was measured, his gestures practiced, his attention unwavering. The master's table was both stage and laboratory, and every word, every glance, every unconscious movement of the Whitfields was being studied, noted, and filed for the moment when patience would ripen into action. By the time the last course was cleared, Samuel had memorized every route, every habit, every weakness. He had observed the master's fondness for particular wines, the way the overseer paced after dinner, and the predictable arrogance with which Whitfield believed himself untouchable. Years of patience had taught him the rhythms of the household, the vulnerabilities of its leaders, and the subtle power that could be wielded from a position that appeared powerless. Samuel's corpulence, his jovial demeanor, had been a mask. It concealed the intelligence, the patience, and the quiet capacity for strategy that would one day make him feared far more than the master himself. Every joke he made, every indulgent bite he took, every nod of compliance was part of a larger performance, a slow-burning theater of inevitability. The overseer might have thought him harmless, the master might have thought him loyal, but Samuel was calculating, remembering, waiting, and in the silence behind his genial facade, the seeds of a reckoning were being sown, patient, precise, and unavoidable. The sun had barely risen over the Whitfield plantation, casting pale light across the sprawling fields that seemed to stretch endlessly into the Tennessee horizon. Samuel moved among the rows of cotton and tobacco, carrying out his morning duties with the appearance of cheerful compliance. He bent easily under the weight of his labor, his large frame hauling baskets and adjusting irrigation lines, all while keeping his mind sharp, observant, and calculating. To the overseers, he seemed indulgent, good-natured, and perhaps even slow to act, a fat man whose jovial demeanor disguised his true intellect. They would never suspect that every motion he made, every conversation he overheard, was being mentally catalogued with painstaking precision. Colonel Whitfield believed himself untouchable. His authority was absolute, enforced through both fear and manipulation. The enslaved workers whispered tales of his cruelty, beatings for minor infractions, threats wielded as routinely as a farmer's plow, and humiliations designed to remind everyone that they were property. Samuel observed it all, not with despair, but with methodical attention. He had learned that patience was more powerful than anger, that subtlety and observation were weapons sharper than any blade or lash. The master's arrogance was a blindfold, one Samuel intended to exploit to its fullest extent. At the house, Samuel's morning duties involved not only physical labor but careful observation. He cleaned floors, arranged trays, and prepared food for the master's table, moving with deliberate slowness that concealed his attentiveness. Every gesture was measured, every smile calculated. He noted the timing of the overseer's rounds, the subtle habits of the servants and the family, and the precise manner in which Colonel Whitfield measured out both punishment and reward. Nothing was wasted in Samuel's mind. Every quirk, every lapse, every indulgence would become a crucial piece of the plan he was building, a plan that depended on years of patient preparation and the quiet complicity of those around him. Other enslaved workers watched Samuel with a mix of curiosity and cautious admiration. They had learned that his jovial exterior masked a keen intelligence, and over time, a silent power began to radiate from him. When he passed, his size alone commanded respect. When he spoke, even softly, his words carried authority. Yet he never acted impulsively. He had learned that quick retaliation could be fatal. Patience, observation, and precise timing were far more effective tools than rash action. The plantation's daily life was a web of routine, and Samuel had memorized every thread. He knew which doors were locked at specific hours, which servants were assigned to which tasks, and how Colonel Whitfield conducted his briefings. The rhythms of the estate, the sequence of meals, inspections, punishments, and personal indulgences were all predictable, and Samuel had internalized each movement like notes in a symphony. The knowledge of this rhythm gave him power. Not the overt, visible power of brute force, but the quiet, terrifying knowledge that he could strike at the right moment with devastating effect. Despite his seeming indulgence, Samuel began testing boundaries in subtle ways. He would slightly delay the delivery of a tray, misplace a tool, or redirect a horse along a different path. Small actions that drew little notice but allowed him to gauge reactions and study weaknesses. Each tiny act of defiance, veiled as incompetence or laziness, was a rehearsal for the larger orchestration to come. The overseers grew increasingly wary of him without fully understanding why, sensing a quiet dominance they could not define. Samuel's size and seeming indulgence became his greatest camouflage. They led the overseers and even Colonel Whitfield to underestimate him, to believe he was too lethargic or jovial to pose a real threat. But beneath the fat exterior lay the meticulous patience of a strategist. Each moment of compliance was a calculated performance, designed to lull the master into a false sense of security, while the seeds of retribution quietly took root. The evening came, and with it, the daily feast. Samuel served the master and his guests with practiced ease, observing every expression, every gesture, every word. He noted the master's indulgences, the small signs of arrogance, and the vulnerabilities hidden behind bravado. Each observation, each nuanced detail, would later become critical in the execution of his plan. He did not speak of his thoughts. He did not act out of anger, he merely watched and waited. Other enslaved workers, aware of Samuel's quiet intelligence, began to mirror his careful observation. Some helped subtly, ensuring that the master's attention remained focused elsewhere. Others remained silent, aware that any noise or comment might compromise the delicate equilibrium Samuel maintained. The unspoken understanding between them was simple. Patience and collective complicity were far more powerful than impulsive rebellion. By nightfall, Samuel had mapped the entire house, the routines of the overseers, and the blind spots of the master. He had observed the habits, weaknesses, and fears that would allow him to exercise control in the coming days. He retired to his quarters with a sense of quiet purpose, knowing that every detail, every observation, and every moment of restraint had been a step toward the inevitable. He was fat, jovial, and outwardly compliant, but he was also patient, intelligent, and deadly in his precision. The fear he would soon inspire in the master and overseers was already taking shape, a shadow as silent and inevitable as the night itself. The sun barely crested the Tennessee horizon, casting pale light across the fields where enslaved workers bent under the weight of routine, cotton, and the ever-present authority of Colonel Whitfield. Samuel moved deliberately among them, his large frame a natural point of attention. To the overseers, he remained the jovial, corpulent figure who seemed more indulgent than dangerous. To the other enslaved people, however, Samuel had become something different, a quiet force, patient, observant, and calculating. Someone whose actions, however subtle, hinted at a deeper intelligence and a capacity for influence beyond the obvious. He began his small, deliberate defiance with the tools available, misdirecting the overseer's horses, subtly delaying the delivery of tools and messages, and occasionally shifting assignments to disrupt the rigid order of the plantation. Each act was minute, almost imperceptible, yet it allowed Samuel to gauge reactions, measure vulnerabilities, and assert an understated control. The overseers began to notice discrepancies, tasks not completed as expected, animals misled, workers slightly out of place, but none connected these occurrences to the seemingly harmless, jovial figure before them. Samuel had become the invisible architect of a growing tension. Serving the master's table remained his most important role. Each time he placed a goblet, lifted a tray, or adjusted the placement of silverware, he studied Colonel Whitfield closely. Every twitch of the hand, every subtle sigh, every moment of distraction was recorded in Samuel's mind. He catalogued which wines the master favored, which guests he admired, and how his arrogance created vulnerabilities. In the eyes of the master, Samuel was a trusted presence, a figure whose loyalty had been earned by years of compliance. In reality, Samuel's compliance was a mask, a necessary facade that hid the slow burn of a carefully conceived plan. The other enslaved workers began to notice Samuel's subtle manipulations. A few followed his quiet cues, redirecting overseers without overt defiance, adjusting tasks with an eye toward allowing Samuel's influence to spread. Their complicity was quiet but deliberate, reinforcing the notion that Samuel's presence was more than physical, it was psychological. Even the smallest acts, like letting the master's horse wander slightly off course or misplacing a tool, contributed to a sense of unease among the overseers and guests, all without drawing immediate suspicion. Samuel's intelligence and observation extended beyond mere physical disruption. He began to anticipate the reactions of those around him. When the master called for a servant to fetch wine, Samuel noted the exact cadence of his voice, the pattern in his gestures, the subtle impatience that betrayed overconfidence. Every conversation at the table, every command issued, every glance exchanged became a data point. He recorded it mentally, mapping weaknesses and potential leverage, preparing for the moment when subtle defiance would escalate into decisive action. The plan was never impulsive. Samuel understood that patience was as critical as strength. By moving slowly, subtly, and with precision, he minimized the risk of detection and maximized the impact of his actions. He let the overseer's arrogance carry them into overconfidence, allowed the master's sense of entitlement to blind him, and ensured that every detail of the plantation was cataloged and memorized. The more the master believed Samuel harmless, the more powerful he became. Over time, Samuel's presence at the master's table and within the household had shifted the dynamic of the plantation. The overseers, initially dismissive, began to feel subtle unease, sensing something in his demeanor they could not name. The other enslaved workers, inspired and reassured by Samuel's quiet intelligence, found courage in his composure. Small acts of defiance, combined with careful observation and timing, began to reshape the balance of psychological power across the estate. The evening brought Samuel back into the kitchen, where he quietly coordinated with trusted allies. They moved in subtle synchronization. One prepared ingredients slightly differently, another ensured the master's preferred items were accessible, while Samuel observed and fine-tuned the process. These small manipulations, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, would become critical components of the larger plan. Each act, each gesture, each careful adjustment was a rehearsal, a calibration, a step toward a future reckoning that was patient, intelligent, and inevitable. As night fell, the plantation seemed calm, its order intact on the surface. Yet beneath that facade, tension and anticipation thickened. Samuel retreated to his quarters with a sense of satisfaction tempered by caution. The first acts of subtle rebellion were complete. The master and overseers remained unaware, yet the scales had already begun to tip. He had demonstrated, without overt confrontation, that his size, intelligence, and patient observation could be turned into quiet power. The true reckoning had not yet arrived, but the foundation had been laid. In the shadows of the Whitfield estate, Samuel's influence had begun to ripple outward. The subtle manipulations, the psychological dominance, the careful cultivation of fear and respect, all had combined to show that even the master's authority was not absolute. And though the overseers and the master believed they ruled with impunity, Samuel had quietly proven that patience, intelligence, and careful observation could turn a seemingly powerless figure into the most feared presence on the plantation. By the early weeks of winter, Samuel's presence on the Whitfield plantation had begun to alter the invisible currents of authority. The overseers and even Colonel Whitfield continued to underestimate him, believing that his corpulence and measured, jovial manner rendered him harmless. Yet Samuel had transformed these assumptions into tools of power. Every chuckle, every deliberate smile, every movement of his heavy frame concealed not indulgence but strategy. He had learned that true strength did not always reside in muscle or stature. It resided in observation, patience, and the skill to wield fear subtly, precisely, and unnoticeably. The plantation's daily rhythms became a canvas on which Samuel painted. He began steering the horses in subtle ways, adjusting the direction of their labor, allowing small missteps that would eventually seem accidental to the overseers. A bridle left slightly loose, a gate nudged open, a wagon guided along an unintended path. Each minor act was calculated to expose vulnerabilities, both of the master's operations and the people enforcing his authority. The horses, once obedient instruments of labor, became extensions of his design, tools in the slow construction of power that he had nurtured in secret for years. Inside the main house, Samuel continued to earn the trust of Colonel Whitfield, now viewed as the obedient, indulged favorite, whose intelligence posed no immediate threat. Each meal he prepared, each tray he carried, each interaction with the master was executed with precision. While he outwardly demonstrated compliance, he memorized every habitual gesture of Whitfield and the overseers. Which hands reached first for the silverware, which servants the master favored, and which corners of the estate were most frequently neglected. Every detail would be crucial when he transitioned from subtle control to decisive action. The other enslaved people had begun to recognize Samuel's growing influence. Those who had endured decades of punishment and humiliation saw in him a leader not by title, but by intellect and quiet power. Some offered tacit support. a hand to steady a tray, a deliberate pause to allow misdirection, a glance exchanged across the kitchen that conveyed understanding without words. This silent complicity amplified Samuel's authority, making him an unseen architect of the plantation's shifting dynamics. Even those who feared him recognized that his intellect and patience rendered him a force beyond brute strength. Samuel's strategy extended beyond minor disruptions. He meticulously planned the timing and methodology of the ultimate confrontation with the overseers and Colonel Whitfield. He studied the layout of the estate, the guard rotations, the vulnerabilities in the master's schedule, and the habits of those enforcing his will. Everyday objects, the bridle, the gate latch, the stable doors were noted as potential instruments of leverage. Nothing in the plantation was too mundane to be overlooked. Each observation and minor manipulation became a thread in the tapestry of the coming reckoning. Psychologically, Samuel had cultivated fear without detection. Overseers found themselves on edge, sensing disturbances in their carefully controlled routines, yet unable to identify the source. Horses misbehaved at just the right moment. Wagons seemed to veer on their own. Tools were occasionally misplaced, and tasks took subtly longer than expected. The plantation's veneer of order began to show cracks, all orchestrated with a deliberate hand that remained invisible. Samuel understood that the most effective form of power was not confrontation, but anticipation, control, and invisibility. He also began preparing allies among the enslaved workers in subtle, strategic ways. The kitchen staff, field hands, and stable workers learned, through glances and small gestures, that their complicity could preserve their lives and amplify Samuel's influence. He did not coerce or demand. He inspired respect and silent obedience. Every movement was measured to ensure that the master and overseers remained unaware of the growing undercurrent of control that now pulsed quietly throughout the estate. The tension on the plantation became palpable. Samuel's every motion, while outwardly harmless, carried the weight of potential influence. He had not yet struck, but the seeds of inevitability had been sown. Even Colonel Whitfield's confidence, once absolute, began to feel slightly fragile in moments when Samuel's gaze lingered on a task or an object. The fat, seemingly indulgent slave had become something more, a figure whose intelligence and patience instilled subtle fear, whose presence suggested that control might not be what it seemed. As the days shortened and winter deepened, Samuel continued refining his plans. His strategy was methodical, precise, and deliberate. He waited for the exact moment when the combination of observation, silent complicity, and the calculated use of everyday tools would converge. The oversight and arrogance of those in power ensured that the moment would arrive, and when it did, the balance of control would shift irreversibly. By the time the first snow dusted the fields, Samuel had established the rhythm of inevitability. The overseers remained blind to the growing intelligence they underestimated. Colonel Whitfield's confidence, bolstered by years of obedience from his enslaved people, made him believe he was untouchable. And Samuel, patient, observant, and meticulous, knew that this very arrogance would be the key to the reckoning that lay just beyond the horizon. The stage was set. The instruments of subtle power had been placed. Samuel's strength, intellect, and patience had transformed him from a seemingly harmless figure into a silent, commanding presence. The plantation was unknowingly poised on the edge of a reckoning that would render size, arrogance, and cruelty powerless against deliberate, intelligent vengeance. The evening arrived with a chill that carried through the Tennessee pines and seeped into the walls of the Whitfield plantation. Candlelight flickered across the dining hall, reflecting off polished silver, crystal goblets, and the gleaming eyes of the master and his guests. The scent of roasted meats, spiced wine, and the lingering tang of tobacco hung thick in the air, masking the tension that was about to erupt in a calculated, inescapable manner. Samuel moved through the shadows, his corpulent frame steady and controlled, every motion deliberate, every glance sharp with observation. The master's table, once a symbol of unchecked authority, would tonight become the stage for the inevitable reckoning that Samuel had orchestrated over years of silent patience. Colonel Whitfield presided over the room with the smugness of someone who believed he was untouchable. His laughter echoed through the dining hall, a testament to arrogance and confidence built on cruelty and dominance. He boasted of his authority, of the obedience he extracted from the enslaved workers, and of the discipline that kept the plantation running smoothly. Samuel watched each gesture, each pause, each subtle twitch of the master's hand, committing every detail to memory. In the eyes of Whitfield, Samuel was the indulgent, fat favorite, harmless, obedient, and too jovial to ever present a threat. But beneath the surface simmered a patient intelligence, a careful orchestration of observation and timing, waiting for the precise moment to tip the scales of justice. The other enslaved workers were present in the periphery, silent but aware, their complicity critical to the success of the plan. Some adjusted chairs, others moved quietly through hallways, all performing subtle maneuvers that appeared routine yet reinforced the structure of Samuel's design. Their silence was as potent as the most violent act. They would not intervene, would not reveal, would not betray. This collective restraint transformed what might have been a solitary act of vengeance into a communal assertion of justice. Each worker understood that obedience could be a mask, and silence could wield power equal to any blade or lash. The first course was served with flawless precision. Samuel had prepared each dish meticulously, ensuring the seasoning was indistinguishable from his masterful culinary reputation. The poison, subtle and measured, lay hidden in the flavors, waiting to take effect. The onset would be gradual, calculated, and unavoidable. He observed the guests' reactions, noting the slight flush of one's cheeks, the subtle tremor in another's hand. Each symptom unfolded exactly as he had anticipated, a testament to both his intelligence and the meticulous patience that had guided his life. Colonel Whitfield raised his glass, oblivious to the quiet orchestration of his undoing. The toast was made with pomp, his voice ringing with authority. Samuel watched, calm and deliberate, as the first visible effects of the poison began to emerge. A slight staggering of posture, a tremor in a hand, a cough masked as a laugh, all small, almost imperceptible. Yet they marked the initial success of his careful planning. The master's arrogance prevented him from noticing the invisible hand shaping his demise. As the evening progressed, the subtle effects grew more pronounced. Guests shifted uneasily in their seats, some grasping the edge of the table, others turning pale. Samuel's patience was unwavering. He moved quietly, ensuring the final course was served in perfect timing, every spoonful carrying the inevitability of justice. The orchestration extended beyond the food itself. Chairs, tables, and even the arrangement of the room were accounted for, all to maximize the controlled impact of the night's carefully executed plan. By the time dessert was presented, the transformation was undeniable. The master's confidence faltered as his body betrayed him. His laughter, once bold and unassailable, became strained and weak. Samuel's intelligence and strategic patience had turned the seemingly mundane into instruments of calculated power. The overseers, who had spent years enforcing authority, now confronted the subtle yet absolute shift in control. Samuel's presence, a corpulent, obedient figure, was no longer merely tolerated. It was feared. Every movement, every breath, every glance carried the weight of inevitability. Outside the immediate scene, the other enslaved workers maintained their silent complicity. They did not cheer, did not speak, did not intervene. They were witnesses and enablers, understanding the gravity of the moment. The plantation's hierarchy, once rigid and unyielding, had been quietly dismantled by observation, patience, and intelligence. Samuel's long-term planning had transformed his size, his presence, and his patience into a weapon far more effective than any whip or tool the master had ever wielded. As the room descended into chaos, chairs scraping, guests faltering, voices rising in panic, Samuel remained calm, composed, and deliberate. He had orchestrated every detail with exacting precision. The sequence of collapse, the subtle spread of fear, and the psychological impact on those who had never expected resistance. Tonight was not an impulsive act of rage. It was the culmination of years of patient observation, deliberate preparation, and strategic patience. The overseer's favored slave had become the most feared presence on the plantation, and the master himself could do nothing to undo the inevitability of Samuel's silent, methodical justice. By midnight, The dining hall was a tableau of quiet suffering and subdued panic. The orchestrated chaos had reached its peak, and Samuel's plan had unfolded flawlessly. The Carringtons, or, in this case, the Whitfields, were no longer masters of the estate. They were vulnerable, exposed, and fully subject to the consequences of their arrogance. Samuel's intelligence, patience, and deliberate strategy had turned the tools of subjugation into instruments of justice. Every movement, every glance, every reaction had been anticipated and accounted for, culminating in the final, inevitable reckoning. The first pale light of dawn stretched across the Tennessee fields, brushing over the Whitfield plantation like a tentative hand, revealing the aftermath of the night's calculated upheaval. The air was heavy with the scent of spiced wine, roasted meats, and something more insidious, a lingering tension that no casual observer could explain. Inside the main house, the effects of Samuel's careful orchestration had left the master and overseers physically weakened, psychologically unmoored, and utterly aware that their authority had been permanently challenged. What had appeared, to the world outside, as the predictable routine of a plantation morning, was now a stage upon which Samuel's patient, intelligent, and deliberate strategy had permanently shifted the balance of power. Samuel moved quietly through the estate, his large frame casting a shadow that seemed to echo the invisible authority he had cultivated over months of observation and subtle manipulation. The other enslaved workers, still composed in the kitchen and the back hallways, followed his cues with an unspoken understanding. Each glance, each deliberate pause, each gesture reinforced the quiet dominance Samuel now wielded without outward aggression. They were allies in silence, participants in the culmination of a plan years in the making. Together, they were a force the master had never imagined, a network of patient intelligence and carefully timed actions. Colonel Whitfield, whose arrogance had once gone unchecked, now sat slumped in the dining hall, his confidence fractured. The overseers, usually the enforcers of discipline and fear, were pale and hesitant, uncertain how to respond to a man they had long underestimated. The very tools of control that had once seemed invincible, the whip, the cane, the threats of punishment now appeared inadequate, almost laughable in their futility. Samuel's presence, his intelligence, and the precision of his patient manipulations had rendered brute force ineffective. Fear, cultivated through observation and patient strategy, had become his most powerful weapon. The plantation was forever altered. Tasks that had once been carried out under strict supervision now unfolded under the subtle control of Samuel, who had established both physical and psychological dominance without a single overt confrontation. The overseers were forced to recalibrate their approach, their authority undermined by the realization that appearances could deceive, that patience and intelligence could overturn years of brutal hierarchy. The other enslaved workers, observing the aftermath, now understood the quiet potency of cunning and patience, and the manner in which one seemingly compliant man could inspire fear beyond his size. Samuel's strategy extended beyond the immediate control of the plantation. He had ensured that evidence of his intelligence and subtle manipulations remained largely undetectable to outsiders. The master's reputation, however, had begun to fracture. Rumors spread quietly among neighboring plantations. A fat slave in Tennessee had quietly become more feared than the master himself. The story circulated not as a tale of brute strength, but as a legend of patient, intelligent rebellion. Even those who had never set foot on the Whitfield estate spoke of a figure whose calculated patience and strategic observation allowed him to invert the power dynamic without resorting to overt violence. The overseers were left to reconcile their disbelief. The tools of their authority, harsh punishments, intimidation, and cruelty, had been rendered secondary to the intelligence and foresight of the man they had underestimated. Samuel's carefully executed acts of subtle disruption, his quiet influence, and his manipulation of both the physical and psychological environment had demonstrated that intelligence and patience were far more formidable than impulsive cruelty. The estate, once a symbol of absolute control, had become a testament to the transformative power of observation, strategy, and calculated patience. Meanwhile, Samuel and his allies moved deliberately to consolidate their control. They ensured that the master's daily routines were subtly altered to reduce opportunities for retaliation. Horses were managed with precision, work schedules adjusted strategically, and key points of vulnerability, doors, gates, and tools were carefully monitored. Every step reinforced the new hierarchy, one in which Samuel's intelligence and patience defined authority, and the former masters were left vulnerable, unsure, and fearful. The psychological impact was perhaps the most significant. Fear now lingered like a tangible presence in the Whitfield household. Even in the absence of immediate punishment, the memory of Samuel's patient orchestration, the subtle manipulations that led to the night of reckoning, permeated every room. Authority had been challenged and redefined without a single overt act of physical rebellion. Samuel's presence alone, quiet and observant, commanded obedience and respect in ways that brute force never could. By mid-morning, the plantation had resumed its outward routine, but the dynamics had irreversibly shifted. The master, the overseers, and the guests of the previous night understood that control was no longer absolute. Samuel had transformed from the indulgent, corpulent slave into the most feared presence on the estate, a figure whose intelligence, patience, and strategic foresight commanded power far greater than size or brute strength alone. His legend grew not only on the plantation but across neighboring estates, whispered among the enslaved as a testament to the potential of patient, intelligent resistance. Samuel had demonstrated that appearances could deceive, that patience was a weapon, and that knowledge, observation, and careful planning could overturn tyranny without rash action. The plantation would remember him not merely as a servant but as a strategist whose legacy was measured in fear, respect, and the quiet assertion of justice. Even as the day progressed and the estate settled into its routine, the underlying tension remained a constant reminder that power could shift quietly, and that one patient, observant man had the ability to redefine the hierarchy of the Whitfield plantation forever. Samuel had become more than feared. He had become inevitable.